Welcome to Bella Podcast. Disease. Sometimes the stigma is more than the plague. Did you see that? The plague. Fast or slow. Sooner or later. People will find a way to control and eliminate it at some point. The stigma is not as if a routine had become a schedule before going to the hospital for the night shift. Dan would stop by Uncle Can's house selling groceries at the beginning of the street. It's not that she needs to buy anything. But for more than a year now, since her mother and father have been living in one place because of all kinds of diseases of the elderly, she has accepted the invitation to come over every day to take care of the urinary catheter as well as monitor it. Vital indicators such as pulse and blood pressure. About a few months ago, she had a few more sores on her back due to being immobile for a long time. And Dan also washed and changed the dressing. Is everything okay with you today? Uncle Tu asked while still sitting on a plastic chair on the veranda, his eyes still not leaving the mobile phone. It seems that you are following the news about the epidemic that is being updated every hour. The sores also accumulate. It is difficult to heal like the original. But this is probably not an infection anymore. Everything else is fine, sir. Dan said and then smiled. As a mandatory communication habit in his work. But then she suddenly realized that she had just made a redundant move because the person who was talking to did not look at her face. She let out a sigh and gathered up the tools she had just used. She said a few words to Mrs. Hai as usual. Her eyes were brighter than usual. And a little more alive than last week. This time, Dan confidently smiled. Because he knew that the person lying there was staring at him. When Dan went to the sink behind, he passed by where Aunt Toucan was watching TV. Television news is also information about the increasingly complicated epidemic situation in China. At the end of the news, the announcer sent the audience a summary of the cases that have been infected around the world. Statistics by country. In Vietnam, it has reached the threshold of 9. What a terrible disease. Aunt Tu said. Dan took off his watch and started washing his hands. While washing, she reassured. This disease is really dangerous. But in Vietnam, no one has died. All cases have been isolated and treated. Partly. As the media also said. The situation is still under control. As long as you follow the recommendations. Such as wearing a mask. Washing your hands. Limiting going to crowded places. You will be fine. Be careful. But don't panic too much. Control. It's not really a child, so I don't worry too much. Uncle Tuesday, you read on the internet, what news have you heard that many people have suffered and died? It's always in Vietnam. Some sources are untrue, exaggerated. Like sentences, stop. I should only listen to the news. From the official channels. Aunt Tu nodded in understanding. Suddenly, Dan saw something strange in this woman's eyes. But since it was time for work, she put that feeling aside and said hello.